Recently, I threw a batch of very simple plates. They were thrown with extraordinarily soft clay that was also quite mouldy, as you can see in the colour change here. I let this clay sit in the reclaim bucket for far too long, so I dried the stuff out on some plaster bats and then threw pots that would take no time at all, so I didn't have to spend too long actually touching the stuff. Initially when I threw these, the clay's colour was entirely like what you saw being revealed in the previous clip. Yet as they dried out overnight, the darker colour disappeared from the outside, leaving the plates looking pretty much like this stoneware normally does. So, to trim these simple shapes, I first tap centre the pot into the middle of the wheel and then secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay. I'll be turning this top surface first to make sure the very subtle curve they have is nice and neat and flows perfectly from the rim to the middle of the plate. I then check the diameter with a pair of calipers, and if it needs it, I'll trim the side ends slightly. All before using a curved plastic edge to burnish the top and smooth away all those turning marks. Now, when I initially threw this mouldy clay, it really smelled quite bad, but the day after, and now these pots are leather hard, they have the normal earthy aroma clay does, so at this point I thought they'd be totally fine. To stop the plate from deforming as I trim the underside, I place a very small pad of foam underneath the plate when it's flipped upside down. And this tends to be enough to support the central portion of the plate and to stop it from bowing inward. The piece is once again tap-centered, so it spins without undulating in any one direction. I then use another pair of calipers to score in a line that'll mark the outermost portion of the foot ring. And then, as I want to trim very close to the rim, I won't use any lumps of soft clay pressed around the rim to secure the pot yet. Instead I push down firmly through a spinner placed on top. And as these are such low, wide forms, it's really easy to keep them centered like this. And it's at this point, when I revealed this grey clay, that the smell came back. At least all these plates are soon going to be fired to 1000 degrees Celsius, and any organic matter will be utterly eradicated, although I'll still need to deal with all the mouldy trimmings. But I'll show you how I do that at the end of this video. But for the time being, despite the smell, I actually really liked how these looked, with the 2 different colours of clay encircling different parts of the plate. With the spinner removed, to keep the pot in place, I now once again use 3 pieces of soft clay which are placed more or less equally around the circumference. I do a first pass trim with a relatively blunt tool just to make sure the base is nice and flat. I then switch to a much sharper tungsten carbide trimming tool to hollow out the inner portion of the foot ring, which I trim down to the same depth as the previously trimmed section on the outside of the foot ring. This way the plates will be nice and light and visually they won't look heavy, which pots can do if you don't remove enough clay from inside the foot itself. You can see there's a light chattering here, which occurs quite easily with these sharper tools. And so to remove it I switch back to one of these blunt steel tools and do another pass over this area to smooth it out. Using my fingertips, I burnish over these bottom edges so they aren't quite so sharp and susceptible to chipping. And then I can stamp this portion of the foot with my maker's mark. To flip the plate back over, I first remove the 3 pieces of clay, and then instead of lifting the plate up itself, I lift the bat it's on and flip it over into my hand. This way I don't mishandle it, such as accidentally bending it too much, which could result in it warping and not firing perfectly flat. So generally, whenever I'm flipping flatware like this, I'll do it between 2 bats, or I'll flip the pot out onto my hands like I did here. And once finished, I put these plates on very flat wearboards, which I do of course so that the plates dry flat. If instead I let some of these dry accidentally on a wearboard that was slightly warped, then there's a chance that these still relatively soft plates would conform to the warped board they're placed on. So I'm really careful about how I dry these pieces after they've been finished. And with flatware, it also helps to dry them out very slowly, as there's such a tendency for them to warp or crack. So I've been stacking these on wearboards like so, and come the end of the day, I'll wrap them all up in plastic. When selecting the next plate to trim, I always pick the driest to work on next, leaving those that are softer so they've got more time to dry out. And when I rub the tops of these, what I'm gauging is how well my fingers stick to the clay. If they feel at all tacky or very cold and damp, then there's a good chance they're too soft to be trimmed. And if anything, I want these to be on the slightly firm side of leather hard when I turn them. If the trimmings themselves are sticking back onto the piece you're turning, then the pot itself is definitely too soft to trim. It should peel off in lovely long ribbons or in smaller flakes like this, but equally, clay can be too firm to trim, and if the carved away clay comes off in tiny shards and is very dusty, then the pot is probably too far gone to trim, and you can actually really injure your wrists after spending a few hours applying too much pressure to trim pots that are too dry. So, what this means is that there is a sweet spot when the clay is easy to trim without being too soft or too hard, and learning how to recognise that stage is key when learning how to trim pottery. And at the start, if you aren't in full control over the drying process, say if you make pots at a community studio or something like that, it can be quite difficult to make sure your pots are in the right condition, as the process of drying pots out properly to work with can take hours. And with these plates, for instance, I might throw them one day and then very carefully dry them over 2 or 3 days, moving them and rotating them to make sure they're perfectly even to trim, whilst of course completing other tasks, all in order to get them just right for the few hours it'll take to trim these. And when the clay is in that perfect condition, it can be just so satisfying to trim, and I think that's partly why I always look forward to this process. This trimmer with the sharp, straight edge is such a useful tool for the pots I make, and the blade really has 3 areas which I utilise most. There's the straight section, there's the tip, and then there's the hook, and all 3 are useful in their own right. The hook portion, which is the corner, I find very useful for removing a lot of mass very quickly, yet the tip is used for more refined work, such as defining the inner section of the foot. And lastly, the straight section of the blade is useful for trimming any straight, flat plane. I switch tools quite often as I work, but I do try and use a relatively limited set of turners, so I don't end up with too many tools around my workbench as I trim. These plates have quite wide and sturdy feet. They'll be coated in a thick layer of crackle glaze and reduction fired to cone 10, and I want to place them in the kiln in areas that oxidised ever so slightly, so that there are very subtle gradients of colour in the glaze itself. I also flip the plate back the right way up and do one last burnish, just to make sure that interior surface is lovely and smooth. And with all the plates turned, I'll wrap them up with plastic overnight. And in fact I left these for 2 weeks like this, as I went for a holiday in Japan, and they all dried wonderfully flat. And the last thing that's left to do is tidy up and deal with the mouldy trimmings that are left over, as if I simply add these back to my main reclaim bucket, then all of that will get mouldy too. And so to deal with it, and you can see the colour change as I spray these, I just shower the trimmings with some relatively powerful anti-mould spray before filling it up with water and giving it a good mix. And this tends to be enough to get rid of it all. At least, I hope it is. It's been a really hectic week since I got back from Japan, but I can at least confirm that my book, By My Hands A Potter's Apprenticeship, is more or less finished, which is a huge relief, and I can't wait to share it all with you. Anyhow, thanks so much for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next week.